It's been a little while since we've cracked into the old PragerU video, but now apparently they're trying to let us know that children are being indoctrinated by leftist propaganda. Oh boy. So before we get into the video at hand, I think I need to correct a mistake of mine from the past. You see, years ago I started a tradition of showing 3 pieces of fan art at the beginning of every recorded video. Since I moved to livestream format, I kinda stopped doing that, but let me see if I can rectify that mistake. So first of all, we have a chibi Suris by YaraKoro, then we have me feeding bread to Ocean in a Lake by JacandQuil, and finally we have My Deep Inner Emotions by Ghost-chan. Thank you all for your fan art submissions, and I am so sorry that I abandoned doing this portion of my channel. Let's get into the video proper.
What's happening in our schools? Colleges have become leftist indoctrination centers. It's not a new problem.
It doesn't take long for this conspiracy theory to come up when talking about education. So let's go ahead and use Occam's razor for just a second, without trying to look into the data or do anything else. Is it more likely that all colleges are all part of a giant conspiratorial network to churn out Marxists, or is it more likely that facts just happen to have a bit more of a left-leaning bias as opposed to a bias towards, say, traditional conservatism? I would say that the more simple explanation is just that there are more facts that are aligned with the left than with the right. But that's just me. What do you think? Let me know in the comment section below before we get into the actual video.
It's been going on for decades, first behind the scenes and now out front. That's how radical change happens. It creeps up on us. And when we finally figure out what's going on, it's too late. What's been happening on college campuses is now happening in elementary schools and high schools.
So if we were to break this down into a syllogism, we would have to first have the premise that all colleges, or at least most colleges, are currently leftist indoctrination centers. Now, we'd also have to define leftist indoctrination centers and try to argue that the left and the right either have an equal access to the facts or that the left is the one engaging in a myth. We would need a lot of things for this to actually be a problem to begin with. But that's not how this video is going to be framed. This is a PragerU video after all, and the thing with PragerU videos is their target audience already has some base assumptions. If you say leftist indoctrination center, they're expecting the knee-jerk reaction of it being a bad thing.
I know. I'm a mom of 2 school-aged kids. I've seen it with my own eyes.
Well, you are the founder of thefabmom.com. I don't know exactly what kind of an expert that makes you. I'm just going to go ahead and say that being a parent does not suddenly make one an expert on their child's education. But after taking a look at her website, I see that she is now apparently working full-time for the first time in a while at PragerU. So,
More and more parents are seeing it too. Thanks to the lockdowns and Zoom, we're getting a window into our children's classes. It's not a pretty picture. Kids, really young kids, are being taught stuff so radical, so devoid of what real education is, it should alarm us all. Here are a few examples. Recently, Chicago Public Schools adopted an American history curriculum based on the 1619 Project published and promoted by the New York Times. The 1619 Project asserts that America's founding was not marked by the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but the arrival of the first African slaves in Jamestown in 1619.
I should probably give some context for this. In America, we are taught a very mythologized version of our past. A version of our founding where the founding fathers are these larger-than-life, nigh-perfect individuals that created one of the greatest documents of all time, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. We have erasures of things like the Trail of Tears, where we slaughtered thousands upon thousands of American natives and forced them to move further and further west, outside of lands they had previously owned. These are all things that when you look at the American history without any type of rose-tinted goggles, you find them. And the 1619 Project seems to have been an attempt to look at this almost rather cynically, but look at this without any of that rose-tinted mythologism. And places like PragerU have a huge problem with that, because they rely on that myth. I'm not going to flat out call PragerU fascist, but that is something that fascism as a political ideology relies on, the mythologized past for us to return to. So it makes sense that people would have issue within those circles with, well, the 1619 Project.
Historians from across the political spectrum have denounced this as a giant lie.
This is a very broad brush reframing of what historians have actually argued about the 1619 Project. If you ask Sean Wilentz, who was a historian who wrote an essay for the New York Review of Books, he argued that the cynical way that the 1619 Project looked at America rendered American history as very white supremacist, which realistically it was. In December of 2019, Gordon S. Wood, James M. McPherson, and Sean Wilentz and Victoria Bynum and James Oakes expressed strong reservations about the project and requested a few factual corrections, and many of these corrections actually were done in the project. The project has not been a stagnant thing since being published, it has been revised since then. This is not the same thing as historians all the world over calling it a giant lie. This is peer review, doing what peer review does in every field that accepts peer review.
The New York Times has walked back many of the project's original claims.
Again, when you engage in peer review, taking certain parts of your hypothesis or findings and restructuring them or deleting them altogether is completely normal and expected in this field. Now, if you're a layman, which is who PragerU tries to push all of their propaganda towards, it sounds like things are changing, but this is what happens in science as well. Our understanding of things isn't exactly stagnant. As we learn more and more about different subjects, whether they be scientific or historical, revisions are made. This is normal. This is expected.
Still, this malicious slander of America is now being taught in schools as truth. And what is that truth? That America is, was, and always has been a fundamentally racist country, and that white Americans today bear responsibility for all current and historic racism.
So, as the 1619 Project is a purely historical venture, that's not what it argues. In fact, actually, if I were to offer some reading on this, I would highly suggest everybody read Howard Zinn's A History of American People. This book basically goes into all of the details from America's founding, from the early times of Columbus to a lot of stuff that happened in the American South, the Civil War, etc. And one of the things that is noted during this is that America has a lot of racial baggage. In fact, our police force here in the South were originally meant to round up slaves. That's what they did. That's what they were created for. Foundationally, they are in fact racist. When you look at things like redlining of districts, this is a thing that was done to change the way that areas voted on racial lines. When you look at America today, while I don't agree with the assessment that all white people are responsible for all current racism, there is some truth to the fact that we, as Americans, do bear responsibility for changing the way the world is right now. We can either accept that the world is the way it is and as broken as it is, or we can try to make it a better place for future generations. Take the way that the public education system works right now, and not in the dishonestly framed way that PragerU is trying to argue it at the moment, but the way that we fund our schools. We fund our schools with local taxes, and these local taxes just happen to end up on racial lines half the time because generational wealth is not something that most Black Americans have access to. This means that you end up having underfunded schools in certain geographical areas, and those areas end up having higher density populations of African American or other minority citizens because generational wealth, which could get them out of these areas and put them into areas with better schooling, for instance, that could lead to better outcomes. These are things they don't necessarily have access to, and as a child, you have no control over this, and as an adult, you still only have limited control over this. Remember, I'm talking about generational wealth. You would have had to have had influence over what your parents did, which is not something anybody has major access to.
This bleeds perfectly into another educational debacle: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this might sound innocent, but don't be fooled.
You know, those exact words could be used to describe practically every PragerU video. But go on, continue.
It's a dangerous euphemism for something called critical race theory. Critical race theory says that racism is woven into the very fabric of American society.
I can go ahead and grant the premise and say that that's not exactly an untrue statement. The idea that there are dividing lines between the races, the idea that stereotypes even exist, are predicated on racism. That is a thing woven into our society, even just culturally speaking. Maybe I should also define critical race theory for a second here. So there are two main things that critical race theorists will agree on. The first one is that white supremacy exists and it maintains its powers through law. Now remember that a white supremacist can also be just somebody who believes that the bell curve justifies that they will be predispositioned as a white person to be less violent and more smarter than a black person, generally speaking. That is a white supremacist viewpoint. You don't have to bomb churches as a skinhead to be a white supremacist. The second thing that most critical race theorists will agree on is that there is an ability for racial minorities to transform the relationship between them and the powers that subjugate them. So by accepting the premise that the law is not in your favor, you also accept that if you live in an area where you can change that law, then, you know, maybe you should. Maybe it's a good idea to do so, to try to make things better for the people who you represent and who you've grown up as. Those aren't necessarily bad things, at least in my opinion, but PragerU seems to think they are. But let's go ahead and continue the video.
What does this look like in a school setting? Middle and high school students in Wellesley, Massachusetts are being taught to be on the lookout for unconscious racial bias in their classmates. "We need your help," an email to students reads. "Your school leaders will be working with you this year on how to be proactive about preventing bias incidents and how to report them should they occur." This warped vision of America doesn't stop at race.
While I'm sure you were about to get to an interesting point, you didn't actually define how any of what you just presented was bad. If what you just presented is as far as it goes, then what you're telling me is that students are encouraged to report abuse, especially if that abuse happens along racial lines. I don't see that as a problem.
In Colorado, first graders are being taught that just because someone looks like a boy doesn't mean they are. Only they can know who they truly are.
Okay, so your issue now is with the idea of gender identity. Now, again, this is something that is entirely harmless. If you cannot define for me the harm in somebody saying that they are either a boy or a girl, then I'm going to go ahead and have to laugh you off of whatever stage or podium that you're speaking from. I am going to go ahead and let you continue this example, but I like how when you tried to argue that the manifestation of critical race theory was that students were encouraged to report abuses to them or their peers, that didn't frame it as something bad. That just framed students as taking responsibility for the actions of those around them. Now, I can't wait to hear your justification against trans people, because that seems to be the battle that most conservatives are fighting now. They realize that they lost the gay marriage battle ages ago, and the abortion battle is one that they realize needs to be maintained in perpetuity, else they have no reason for people to vote for them. So let's go ahead and battle trans people, I guess.
Gender is something they choose for themselves, based on how masculine or feminine they feel. Or maybe they're not fully a boy or a girl, but something in between, whatever that may be. To repeat, that's what children are taught in first grade.
So I don't see an actual issue with this. Teaching children to basically ask for somebody's pronouns right after asking them for their name isn't a bad thing, because when they grow up and they go into the real world, they will encounter trans people. They will encounter people who are non-binary or androgynous, who they're not able to identify even if they are cis. And instead of having them assume their gender, they're being taught, at least according to the way you're framing it, to ask, to just understand that what they see as a boy or a girl may not match what that person's identity is. That's not harmful. That's just teaching them habits of respect that will transfer better into the real world when they get older. asking somebody their pronouns, or even checking their pronouns online if you happen to have a resource like Twitter that you're speaking through, isn't exactly a bad habit. And I've never had anybody give me a good argument as to why it's bad to be taught that sometimes you don't know what somebody's gender is. And remember, gender and sex are not the same thing. Sex is purely biological, whereas gender is purely a matter of identity.
Imagine what they're taught in 2nd or 3rd grade. And, of course, the world faces imminent disaster from global warming. The American Federation of Teachers has fully endorsed the most radical aspects of the Green New Deal.
So, accepting that global warming or climate change is a thing is not the same thing as accepting all the radical aspects of the Green New Deal. However, what is being argued here from PragerU is not necessarily that they're right or wrong on this ordeal. They're using the Green New Deal as a shorthand. Most conservatives, when they hear the Green New Deal, are immediately going to think of politicians like AOC or Bernie Sanders that they don't like and don't support, and they will immediately have a shorthand to argue against this. Global warming can't be real because the Green New Deal is bad. They might not think of it in those terms, but because PragerU is framing it this way, that's how it's going to shorthand in the brain. And that's what they do. PragerU, at the end of the day, is propaganda. So the way they frame these things is deliberate. They're not trying to say one thing or the other because they think that it's more or less correct. They're saying them in the way they do because that's what manipulates the audience better.
Which is already featured in California school curriculums. In some, many of our schools are teaching children that our past is terrible and that they have no future.
If I were to use the critical race theory example that you gave earlier, it's not that the past is terrible and therefore you have no future. In fact, the second premise is that the future is yours to claim. The future is that of the people who inherit it. You need to try to make a world better for you and the people who will come after you. Nobody's saying that children don't have a future, and nothing you've presented here, especially when I look at the actual evidence behind it, suggests that.
That if they are white, they are racist whether they know it or not.
And this one is a deliberate misunderstanding of how we understand whiteness in sociology. In sociology, whiteness is not something that is inherent to an individual. It is a power structure that circumstantially has existed throughout time. For instance, I was arguing with a friend of mine at one point that white supremacy is a thing, or white privilege is a thing. And they argued that, well, no, it's that the majority in a given area generally have the privilege. And I said, yes, while that may be fair, what is the majority in the United States? It is white. And our history, ever since we've colonized this place, has been one of white dominance. Not individual white people using their whiteness as some kind of superpower, but circumstantially a Western white culture. That's not an argument that people are individually racist in their deepest hearts of hearts. And there are some authors recently who have tried to argue that that's the case, and I have some severe problems with that framing. It is better to look at these things academically as a matter of systems, not as a matter of individuals who are just corrupt to their core or something.
If they're black, they're victims, whether they experience it or not.
And the way that you're trying to frame this is that you are a victim whether you experience something that victimizes you. But I'm going to go ahead and throw the counter argument that if you live in a system where you are more likely to be killed or more likely to be subjugated and thrown into prison, where the 13th Amendment argues that you can now be made a slave again, then yes, you are a victim within that culture. That does not mean that you need to have a victim mentality, mind you. It means that you need to try to rise above that, whether that be through individual action or whether that be through solidarity with other people who share your same racial or economic class. You need to understand that being a victim, circumstantially, does not mean that you need to engage in a victim mentality. But PragerU's audience likely is going to take something like this and frame it in their minds as being a victim means that somebody has a victim mentality. This toxic way of engaging in discourse basically pollutes any type of conversation that can be had about corrupt or unjust systems.
That they should constantly question their sexual identity.
Again, something that is not harmful, and you have not demonstrated as harmful. When I started using this avatar, I realized that I was gender apathetic, because I had just assumed that, yeah, no, I'm a cishet white guy, and that's just how things are. And then I found that, well, no, I'm a cishet white guy, but if I woke up tomorrow in a woman's body, I probably wouldn't care. It really wouldn't affect my day at all. In fact, it would just mean that I now have another avenue of myself to explore. That's not a bad thing. So even if I accept what you're saying as 110% correct, you have not demonstrated the harm.
With all this being drummed into their heads, no wonder today's kids have more psychological problems than any previous generation.
And now we have a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. We have these things happening now, therefore it must be the fault of those things. This is the same thing that anti-vaxxers use to try to argue that the MMR vaccine causes autism. When you have these structures here, when you have the structure of a changing educational landscape and then a structure of a degrading psychological landscape, there are other factors that we need to look into. Could it be that the world itself is in fact becoming a worse place, and that coincidentally is happening along the same time as we are understanding better things about gender and race? That can lead to several people having psychological issues. Could it be that the middle class is shrinking, and the prospects of children being able to go and live their dreams when they become adults is becoming a less and less viable concept? That is another thing that can lead to poor mental health, and yet you have not considered it in the framing here. It must be the gender ideology, it must be the racial conversations. Those must be the thing that are causing people's difference in psychological framing. Now, framing is the key word there, though, because it could also be that as our understanding of psychology increases, as we learn more about the human brain and the way that it functions, we are able to identify different things that are neurodivergent. And you, as the presenter on PragerU, could just as easily be presenting those neurodivergent people as a rapidly declining psychological landscape, when all that's truly happened is that our ability to diagnose has expanded. All of these things have to be considered when making a broad and sweeping statement like you have, but you haven't, because you have an agenda.
Maybe you think I'm cherry-picking examples to exaggerate my point. Or maybe you're one of the lucky ones who sends your kids to a school that has yet to be infected by this radical agenda. Maybe. But if I were you, I wouldn't take it on faith.
I didn't realize we'd be getting some self-awareness from PragerU today. So at least they do recognize that what they're doing looks like cherry-picking, sounds like cherry-picking, and acts like cherry-picking, but then they have the fear-mongering at the end there. I wouldn't take it on faith. Now, even though that is presented there so that a conservative who is questioning the narrative that they're presenting here might go, oh no, what if it's really real? I think that us as a very critical audience can look at this and see it for what it is. It is fear-mongering.
Find out for yourself. When I did, I was shocked to learn that all of this is happening in my school district.
The do-your-own-research argument, one of the favorites of flat earthers and anti-vaxxers. What I mean by that is, if I give you some charged phrases like the earth is flat, for instance, and then you start Googling that, you might actually find some articles that engage in confirmation bias for you. For instance, if I wanted to learn more about race relations as they exist through violence, and I looked up black-on-black violence, I would find articles that state that, yes, there is a high propensity for black-on-black violence in the United States, and I would then use this as an argument against anybody saying that police brutality is a problem in black society. Now, if I were to take a more neutral stance and say, hey, what if I were to look up racial violence? Just racial, so I could see how this works across the spectrum. I would find that white-on-white violence proportionally happens just as often as black-on-black. And since, geographically speaking, we have fewer mixed areas than we have homogeneous ones, it would make sense that a lot of this comes down to geography. You hurt who's around you. Now, suddenly, I don't have the same leg to stand on when trying to argue against the police brutality argument. But if I walked in with the do-my-own-research mentality and the charged phrases that I was given to begin with, I would more likely come to the conclusions that someone like PragerU wanted me to come to because I am engaging in the argument on their terms merely by going into the Google search bar and looking things up in a non-neutral fashion.
Right now. So find out what's being taught in your kid's school. Take a good hard look at curricula. Ask administrators if they endorse the 1619 project. Are they pushing a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda? If so, demand to see what materials the school is using.
Again, we see the deliberate framing of this through PragerU's argument. You have to already accept the premise that the 1619 project is bad, corrupt, or a lie to engage in those kind of questions with the teacher. The question that you should be asking, if you are looking at a teacher who does endorse the 1619 project, is why do you endorse it? Is it historically accurate? How do you know that it is historically accurate? Those kind of questions can lead to conversations, as opposed to what PragerU is asking, which is, see if they engage in it, and if they do, stop the conversation and then demand to look at their materials. Because if you go into this without the understanding of why, when you go to those materials, you're going to find stuff that you don't like or don't want. For instance, if I handed you an article on the social construction of gender, if you go in with the premise that social construction of gender is automatically a bad thing, this article is going to do nothing but piss you off. If I don't engage in that conversation of how social construction doesn't mean something's not real, and liken it akin to something like, say, money, you're going to be walking into this with a completely different framing than if you were to walk into this the way that PragerU is trying to force you to, where you walk in with their framing. And please take note, that's all deliberate. That's what propaganda is, and that's what it does. It keeps the conversation in their terms, and makes it so that you either find stuff that lets you engage in confirmation bias, or you find enemies to fight on behalf of whatever ideology a place like PragerU is trying to push on you. Now, there's only a few seconds left in the PragerU video, and if you really want to hunt those down, then be my guest, you can do so on your own time. What I want to do is conclude with why do we do responses to stuff like PragerU? If everybody already knows they're wrong on X, Y, and Z, why talk about it? Well, for one, just practically speaking, not everybody knows that Prager's wrong on stuff. Secondly, and probably a little more importantly, at the end of the day, it's not about just dunking on PragerU and letting people know that they're wrong, 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 wrong. It's about letting people realize when they're being propagandized to, and letting people realize that the information they consume on places like YouTube is being consumed through a filter, the filter of the presenter. If you're watching stuff on my channel, you are being given information through a filter. Make no mistake. It's my opinion. It's the information that I have been able to dig up. It's the way that I interpret the data and information that I find. That's why when I do edited content, I try to have sources in the description so you can do some reading on your own if you choose. You may come to different conclusions. But I want you to know that when you are watching a video, you are watching that presenter's response. And it's probably a good idea to try to think of what that presenter is trying to get out of this ordeal. What are they trying to convince you of? Because when you have that information, sometimes it might be easier to tell when you need to engage in some pretty thorough fact-checking for whoever you're watching. I'm already going to tell you to fact-check me. It's a thing that I've done in the past and I'll continue to do in the future. So, I guess I'll just leave with this. I'm going to, every Monday, start doing edited content again on this channel. I know that I have been very, very lax in doing edited content on the channel since I started doing VODs and doing more live streams, but there are things that I can do better in edited form, more information that I can look up, more sources that I can get access to when I have the ability to pause my own recording. And also, there are things that I'm not able to do very well on the fly during live streams either, like grabbing the fan art and just showing it off in the order that it is submitted to me. That's a lot harder to do in a live format than it is in pre-prepared. So, every Monday, for the time being, I'm going to be going into doing these types of edited videos again. And hopefully you guys will be here for that. They take a lot more work, so I can produce fewer videos of other varieties on the channel, unfortunately, but hopefully it's worth it for you. Before we close out, I do want to go ahead and thank everybody who's watching and all of my patrons who support and fund and allow me to do what I do on my channel through all of the iterations and changes to the channel format, tone, and aesthetics. I know when you find a creator that you like, and they change things up, that can be really disheartening. And I'm incredibly thankful for all of you who have stuck with me through the years as I've grown as a person, as I've grown as a presenter, and as I've grown as a content creator. A couple of things going forward. Every Monday is going to have an edited video on this channel, and every week or two there's going to be another type of edited video on my gaming channel, Suris. If you want a palate cleanser from the stuff I talk about on this channel, but you still like me and the stuff that I do, then maybe go over there. I've got a presentation on Sonic Adventure 2 over there right now, and I'll have a video going up soon about issues with scalpers in the Pokemon card game. I also have a Twitch channel that I'm trying to grow. If you want to hang out, I'm going to be streaming over there as often as I possibly can, so please check out Suris over on Twitch as well. Follow me over there, and I will see you over there. I haven't got a schedule set up perfectly well because my sleep schedule is incredibly bad, but I'll just go ahead and end on this. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for supporting me. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.